the captives set free. A great liberation, if you will. Freedom from being caged and forced into something that none of us would choose, so that we would have the freedom to choose that or to not choose that even. Freedom itself accomplished. Imagine, if you will, the best weekend of your life. If you just a moment, just picture in your mind, you can close your eyes if you need to, but picture in your mind, what is the best weekend you could ever think of? Maybe you would spend it on the beach. Maybe you would take a trip to the mountains. Maybe somebody in here might like skiing. Maybe some of you would just like to take a nice 3-day nap. Anybody identify with that? Yeah, a lot of us do. For some of us, that might be the perfect weekend. Why do these things sound so wonderful when we talk about them and we dream about them? Why does the perfect weekend seem so great? I would like to suggest it's that one word, freedom. It's that one word because it means freedom from work. It means freedom from school. It means freedom from the mundane and from the ordinary, from the grind. It means freedom to just be. Freedom. But if we fail to see what the ultimate act of freedom really is, if we don't look back and say this was what freedom really means. You see, to be free, to just have fun is great. Freedom from human slavery is great and necessary. Freedom from an oppressive system or nation is great, but none of them are fully realized until we acknowledge history's ultimate act of freedom. And so that's why the title of this message today is very simply, The Best Weekend of Your Life, but it's already happened. Let me explain. One of the unique aspects of Christianity, when you compare Christianity with any other faith or religion, is that it traces its origin to one particular event on one particular day in history. One day there was no such thing as a church. The next day there was the church. There was suddenly a group of people who believed in the resurrection of Jesus and even suffered for it some very extraordinary things because they believed in it so strongly. There are 4 biographies in the Bible about the life of Jesus Christ. They're in the New Testament. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 biographies about his life when he was here on earth. 4 different accounts of that. And all 4 of these biographies, the last week of Jesus' life is given the most attention. That's because the early followers, those people who were not a part of the church and then all of a sudden were, those early followers, they insisted with remarkable clarity that one particular event in history actually happened. That Jesus was in fact killed, and then he did in fact rise again from the dead. All of them believe that. And so you find that account in all 4 of the Gospels. And most of the time spent on that last week of his life. Many of us don't really understand, actually. There's a backstory to this. There's a backstory to this idea of resurrection, and that backstory is very critical to our understanding of this incredible story and a powerful reason for understanding that this resurrection did happen. I'd invite you to turn to Mark chapter 16 and keep your finger there. That is going to be where we spend a fair amount of time. If you don't have a Bible, please use one of the ones we have given for you to use. It should be in the back of the pew in front of you. Feel free to take one if you don't have one of your own. The human race has always been troubled by what happens after we die. I mean, every culture, just about every background has a different story about what happens to a person after they die. There were, in the ancient world, people who believed that when you die, you just kind of go out like a candle and that's it. There are other people who believed there was an underworld where departed spirits went upon death, and in this underworld, the spirits had this shadowy existence, and that they couldn't come back to this world, but they existed in some level or another. But if you look at the people who wrote this book, the Bible, predominantly, they were all Jews, and they all had something in common. And that one thing that they had in common was a resurrection. They believed that there was going to be a resurrection. This idea was around a long time before Jesus was ever here, by the way. The Jews had always believed in a resurrection. They believed that there's a great God who created all things. They believed that one day He would bring the righteous back to life and heal all of creation. This is really important now. What the Jews believed is that this would happen at the end of history. They believed that at the end of all things, those who were righteous would be resurrected and that all creation would be healed at the end of history. But nobody in Israel would have ever believed that there would be a resurrection in the middle of history. Think about that for a moment. The Jewish world, the world that Jesus Himself came out of when He was on earth, and all of His disciples and everyone who wrote in here, including the New Testament, they all came from the background. Yes, the resurrection will happen, but it's going to happen at the end, not in the middle. The problem that the Jews had some 2,000 years ago then surrounded a man named Jesus Christ and his motley crew of followers, and they claimed that this man was the Messiah, that He was the great liberator, if you will. He was the one that would open the birdcage. They thought of Him as potentially the one who would... A lot of people thought of Him as this guy who would potentially rescue them from human slavery and oppression in the form of their Roman owners, if you will. That's what they thought about this man, yet He avoided being this kind of Messiah. He claimed to be Son of God. He claimed even that He would be killed but would come back to life. And that's a pretty significant thing, because think again about what the Jewish belief was. There would be a resurrection of the righteous. The righteous would be the ones that came back to life. Now, the Jews, what they would do is they would wind up accusing Jesus of something that was the exact opposite of being righteous. They accused Him of being a blasphemer. Here's what that means. A blasphemer is one who speaks reproachfully against or rails at what is righteous. They accused Jesus of being somebody who spoke against righteousness. And here this man was claiming to be the Son of God. Luke 20 and 23 tell the story of why this man was tried and put to death. And just to briefly touch on that story, starting in verse 70 and 71 of Luke chapter 22. It says there, they all said, "Are you the Son of God?" And so He said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from His own mouth." Blasphemy. So in front of the Sanhedrin, the charge was blasphemy against Pontius Pilate in verse 1 of chapter 23. Then the whole multitude of them rose and led Him to Pilate, and they began to accuse Him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So here he is charged with blasphemy against the Jewish people, but he's even being charged, because that's the only way they were going to get this guy dead, he's even being charged of blaspheming the Romans, if you will. Blasphemy, the exact opposite of righteousness. This was the basic foundational charge that was brought against Jesus Christ that would ultimately lead to him being nailed to a cross. But you can see right here, the battle lines are drawn for more than this man's death. Because what did the Jews believe? It was the righteous who would be resurrected at the end of time. What did Jesus say? That he would be in the tomb for 3 days and then rise again. Get the picture. If Jesus did rise again, that means he's right. If Jesus rises again, it proves he's righteous. And it proves that these Jewish rulers were wrong. The battle lines were drawn. There was a lot at stake here. Some people believe, if you go back far enough in time, that in the ancient world, that the people who lived in that time were just gullible. They believed that they were ignorant people, not having the access to the education that we have today, that they were, they would just believe anything if it supported what they were supposed to, what they thought they were supposed to do. And so a lot of people kind of accuse Christians of that day, and us by extent, of being those gullible people. What C.S. Lewis called this was chronological snobbery. Basically saying that everybody back then is dumb and everybody now is smart. He called it chronological snobbery. Here's the thing. Ancient people were not that dumb. They knew that people who died tended to stay dead. There have been a lot of people who'd come along saying that they were the Messiah before. This wasn't the first person to have pretty much taken on that claim. All those Messiahs in the past, by the way, they died. And they stayed dead. And if they wanted to keep a movement going, they would have to do one of a few different things. Possibly they could make up a story about having seen this person rise from the dead and see how many people would go along with it. Or they would have to go and follow a completely different movement, because obviously the one they had been following was wrong. N.T. Wright, he's a very famous New Testament scholar, he says there were many messianic movements in the first century. In every case, the would-be Messiah got crucified by Rome, just like Jesus did. And not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming their hero had been raised from the dead. So if this is what is the background here. They knew that people who died tended to stay dead, and no Messiah had any followers up to this point that claimed that their Messiah was back. Didn't happen. As we would expect, Jesus' followers believed that they were finished in the wake of Jesus' execution, but then two things happened. We already know about the disciples right after the crucifixion. They run, they hide, they go away, they think they're done. Then two things happen. And that's what we're talking about today in Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 16, here's what the story says. Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices that they may come and anoint him. Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen, and they said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What happened? First, First thing that happened, witnesses saw that the tomb was empty. The second thing is we know Jesus actually did appear to his followers. It was just the empty tomb, but Jesus didn't appear to anybody. Skeptics could say, well, that's just a case of grave robbery. No big deal. But according to the biographies and eyewitness accounts, Jesus actually showed up. His followers made claims about this Messiah that had never been made before. On the other hand, if people had reported that they had seen Jesus, but the tomb still had Jesus' body in it, skeptics would then claim that those people were having hallucinations, wouldn't they? Well, his body's still in the tomb. There's no way you're actually seeing that. If the Romans could have produced the body, they would have done so. The graves of heroes and crucified messiahs were commonly venerated as shrines by their followers. But the problem with Jesus is that the tomb was actually empty. They couldn't find the body. And meanwhile, people were saying they saw him living. There's another reason that we know the resurrection actually happened. Mark says that the tomb was first discovered by Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. In ancient Israel, we have to understand something. In ancient Israel, women were so low in status that they weren't even regarded as credible witnesses. It's just the way it was. If you're going to make up a story about Jesus' resurrection, there would have been no advantage to having women serve as eyewitnesses. If you're going to make something up, you're going to make up the story with some credible witnesses. But here, these accounts all say that the first witnesses were women. What's the advantage to that? The only plausible explanation for why all four Gospels say the first witnesses of an empty tomb were women is that it was women who found the empty tomb, and the tomb was, in fact, empty, because nobody in their right minds would have even thought to use these three ladies as the credible witnesses. But here they were the first ones to go along with all the other evidence. It wasn't too long before those who followed Jesus came to understand that what had happened didn't just affect Jesus. Christ's followers began to piece together that the age to come that they were all looking for had begun that day in Jesus Christ. Soon after the resurrection, Christ's followers realized that when Jesus died on the cross, it was more than just his death, it was their death too. They realized that on the third day, the greatest step in human history had been taken. The stone was rolled away, and Jesus stood at the threshold of the tomb. And that first step he took changed the world. Here is where it gets personal, because there's one more step that needs to be taken by each of us today. It's a step into our own resurrection. Last week, it was such a blessing to baptize Ronell Moline. And all the stuff that came after it was really great too. But seeing him baptized, that was a major step. Because what it symbolizes was him going into the water, dying in Jesus, leaving the old self behind, and coming up out of the water brand new and transformed, resurrected in Jesus Christ. And it's the step that we all need to take. And if you haven't taken that step, today's the perfect time to take it. The story of the resurrection isn't just good news, it's true news. When Jesus says to the woman in John 11, 25 through 26, he says there, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. That's not just some metaphor or some vague hope. It means that death has no power to take you from the arms of God. Guilt cannot separate you from God. Whatever bad news you face, that cannot separate you from God. If you have crossed that line, if you have made that decision from in the tomb to outside the tomb in Jesus' resurrection, it means you have a resurrection coming. Witnesses saw the empty tomb. Jesus appeared to his followers. It is true news. And guess what? Today, there's a resurrection coming. To the elderly person whose health is frail, maybe it's almost gone, you don't have to live in fear because there's a resurrection coming. To the devastated husband whose wife has left you and you feel betrayed and alone, you don't have to live as though you're some kind of loser because you have a resurrection coming. To the frightened parents of a depressed child, you don't have to be weighted down by guilt and blaming yourself because there's a resurrection coming. To the anxious worker who's lost their job, you have a resurrection coming. To the guilt-ridden addict hiding in the shadows, you have a resurrection coming. To the lonely young person longing to be loved, you have a resurrection coming. Whoever you are, if you've taken that all-important step of faith, you are living a new reality and transformed. The Father's arms are plenty strong. They haven't lost any of their power, and they can pick you up because there's a resurrection coming. That weekend nearly 2,000 years ago was really the best weekend of our lives. It's the ultimate liberation, and it can still be the greatest weekend of your life, even today. There's a step for each of us to take in two parts. The first one, die in Jesus. Embrace that death in Jesus. The Bible says in 1 Peter 2:24 that he himself, Jesus, bore on his own body on the tree our sins, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness. When we say, I die in Jesus today, it means I'm taking the old James, the sinful person that the devil has been messing with and playing games with for so long, and I'm putting him on the back of Jesus, who takes him to the cross with him. And the second step is very simply, live in Jesus. Die in Jesus and live in Jesus. Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Jesus Christ lives in me. You can turn that into a prayer. You can say, Jesus, I have been crucified with you. Use your own name even, Jesus. James has been crucified with you. It's no longer James who lives, but Christ lives in me. You can do that. Die in Jesus and live in Jesus. It's simple. It's so simple. And it's taking on a completely different and transformed life. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:17, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. All things have passed away. Behold, all things are made new. Do you want to be new today? It's all because the resurrection really happened. And because it really happened, we can live new today. We can be new creations.
I'm not sure how. What's the word for being both terrified and excited? Do you know? All I know is that I ran from that tomb faster than sandals ought to be able to carry you. I had to tell everyone. Jesus had been crucified. We were afraid. We hid. For 3 days, we hid. But on Sunday morning, some ladies and I, we went to the tomb to prepare his body with spices and oils. It was the least we could do. But then, when we got there, the tomb had been moved. Blinding angels, Roman soldiers silenced. Unnecessary grave clothes folded neatly as if they had a secret to tell. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then an empty tomb is worth 1,000 promises. We had been expecting a Messiah to restore Israel. But Jesus, he exceeded all expectations. Jesus was the Messiah that would not be contained, could not be contained. We were hoping too small. Do you know what this means? This means that whatever has been taken from us can be restored in Jesus. Not even death can stop what Christ has given us in life. It means that our strongest enemy has now been defeated. So you tell me, what can stand against Jesus? Who can stand against him? No kings, no presidents, no powers can stop the mortal from putting on immortality. Christ has softened the sting of death and swallowed up our defeat and his victory. Jesus is not dead. He's alive. He has not been taken away. He's alive. Our Messiah, your Messiah, my Messiah. I know he's alive. You know he's alive. And the secret is out.
This doesn't have to be a secret. Let's not keep it one. But let's just consider, what is it God's putting on our heart this today. On there you'll see a few options about what our next step is, and what your next step may be, might not even be on here. But this is an opportunity for you to respond. Maybe today it's just a matter of saying, I choose to die. I choose to die in Jesus, to allow him to take those sins in my past and whatever junk I have in the past, and just let Jesus have it and take it to the cross. Maybe that's your step today. Maybe your next step is for you. Maybe you choose today to live in Jesus. Transformation is not just about death, it's about resurrection. It's about saying, not only am I putting myself in Jesus to die, I'm putting myself in Jesus to come to life in him. So that it's no longer me walking around, breathing, living, speaking. It is Jesus Christ living in me. And maybe today you just want Jesus Christ to live in you too. Maybe today is the first time you've ever thought about, or you've been thinking about it for a long time, to choose to follow Jesus into the cleansing waters of baptism. Last week was an incredible blessing, but it's a blessing that shouldn't stop there. If there's others that have never considered this before, what that is it is an opportunity to say to everybody else symbolically, I have chosen to be transformed, to die and to live in Jesus Christ. And if that's your choice, mark that down, or you can speak with me. I would love to talk with you more about that. But let's just take a few moments. I'm going to have a word of prayer and give you some time to consider what is it that you're called to do. What is your next step with Jesus today? Lord, thank you so much that your death and resurrection actually happened and that we can actually be transformed. Be with us now as we consider what is it that we need to do. What step should we take with you this morning in Jesus' name? Amen.